Hello and welcome. Today we're going to talk about what our predictions are for the auto industry in 2024.
Always great to put a flag in the sand to see how accurate we will be at the end of the year. Let's jump into it.
And it's interesting when you look at, we're 2 months into the new year realistically now, or a month and a half. And, there's always the hype that happens in January 3rd, 4th, when VFAX comes out. The traditional journalists look at it and go, yeah, great year, wow, 1.2 million sales, 1.216 to be exact, after a year of 1,081,000. So, that's 135,000 extra cars sold. Now, they're not sold, they're reported sold, they're registrations. Not necessarily orders taken, as we know, we keep qualifying that number. This is not sales. This is numbers that are registered or claimed to be registered. They're not sales, they're allegedly deliveries, but realistically they're registrations. So yes, there's been a lot of demand there, but there's for as many winners, there's some significant losers year on year, which when we know how the industry works, you've got a market that was up 12% year on year, and yet there's an expectation. Every one of those car companies is now going to be expected that it's a 1.2 million car market and you need to sell more. So your overseas head office is going to say you must do more. But there's been quite a few brands that actually went backwards because it's the reshuffling of the deck chairs as to who's jockeying for position. There's no surprises Chinese brands have done well, but it's interesting to see a lot of European brands have gone backwards, which is a surprise. There's some Japanese brands have done well and others have not. So it's going to be an interesting market. And if you're a van brand and you primarily work in the van space, the vans have actually gone backwards year on year, which I would have thought vans would have continued to be strong, given that we are very much in the e-commerce economy, which is entrenched post-COVID. I think it may actually show a sign of still some supply constraints, maybe some exits in the market from a product perspective, but also potentially some reduction in demand, given that we've had a lot of vans purchased over the last few years. But that, mind you, vans aren't a big market.
I think, Mark, you make a very good point, because the fact is the average market is only probably 1,040,000 or 50,000. So even though we had a 1.1, 1.2 market, it's going to go back to that 1,050,000. And then, as you say, the overseas parent companies are going to still demand a 10% increase on the previous year, because that's just natural human instinct. So they're going to be gearing all the local distributors to commit to that sort of volume. And they're not going to allow you to back off on that volume. And it's going to be through to mid-year before you can start saying, okay, there's a problem here, we need to back off on that volume. But it's going to be a very difficult situation, very difficult discussions with your overseas parent company to try and justify why you want to cut volume when they expect the market to be higher. And I think the second point you made is all that pre-reporting and whether it's a real sale or not, because that sort of creates a sort of mist over the whole market to what the real figures actually are. And that makes the situation even more difficult when you're trying to justify why you need to pull back volume. No one believes you because if they look at the market's still very strong. You're trying to say the market's back and forth. So it becomes quite a difficult situation.
With 30 years' experience in auto logistics and state-of-the-art locations in 5 major Australian cities, Precar Fleet Services are a premier all-in-one solutions provider for commercial vehicle fleet operators, leasing companies and original equipment manufacturers. Please visit precar.com.au and click on the link to Fleet Services.
So it comes down to the segments. If you really drill down to which segments went up and which ones went down, SUVs are still the biggest market. Medium SUVs the biggest market. Ironically, the 2 best-selling vehicles are medium pickup and cab chassis, and primarily 4x4, Ranger and Hilux, which are fantastic vehicles. But that segment is only 200,000 units. If you look at the medium SUV, it's 268,000, up from 216. So there is still that migration to a medium SUV. The medium SUV has well and truly taken the place of the large car. It's the family car, it's the workhorse vehicle. There's some really good choice out there, but it's starting to get very crowded. So, all brands want to gain a big chunk of that. And yes, you had a growth in that segment, but you also had a migration still out of small. So, light cars continue to go backwards. So year on year, they're down 12%. If you look at the other segments backwards, vans, I mentioned before, medium and even small vans were down 12%. So the medium van segment's the biggest one, but it's not a huge segment. It's only 20,000 vehicles. If you're a brand that has a lot of eggs in the van basket, well, you're going to find it a bit tough. And especially if you've usually given a target of, say, 10,000, well, that whole van segment is 30,000 at best, and it's dominated by 2 to 3 key players. And if your overseas head office says to you, well, we want to have a target of 10,000 and be positive about it, and by the way, you've only got a manual vehicle, it can get a bit hard. And then you look at your other passenger portfolio, if you're a small car brand, well, that's tough work too, because there's not a lot happening in that space. Small cars went back 4%. So it is all very much small, is SUV, and SUV is getting crowded. So this is where things are tightening up, finances are tightening up. Is supply catching up to demand? Answer you hear a lot is yes. You still hear some people say, I'm waiting a year for a car, I'm that far out. Well, it may be for certain models of certain specs, but there's a lot of other cars here in the meantime. And those cars will need to find a home, and already starting to see the demonstrated clearances. It's great to see the finance rates are back. Some brands are going, doing a bit of a retro, early 2010s and 11s, with big 1%ers and all this sort of stuff. Subvented finance is back. So it's good to see. And right now, with interest rates where they're at, a subvented finance campaign is a very attractive proposal for retail buyers. The downside is it costs you a stack of money. But the thing to be mindful of as consumers, if you look at it, those subvented finance rates are at 3-year terms. That means you pretty much have to have the money ready to go to buy the car outright, to make those monthly payments, because they're going to be huge. Benefit is you're going to save money, so you may as well make money out of having the car and then put the money that you were going to pay the car cash for into a high interest account, and that will pay for your interest on your vehicle, and you'll make a bit along the way. So these are some of the clever tricks that savvy, cashed up investors can make right now when you get those subvented campaigns.
We're starting to see the new fuel efficiency emission standards coming out. How do you see that will impact the market? And do you see that having any impact in the short term? Do you think companies will start to adjust what they're doing in the market? Or do you think that will only start to play once it comes into operation and start to operate from next year?
Realistically, John, that won't really make it. You won't be able to affect that till next year because the stock here and now is the stock here and now. And the stock that's coming is the stock that was ordered 6 months ago. So you're not going to change any of that. And that's the stock that's going to arrive here before June. So there's no changes to that. There's no changes to product portfolios in time. So it'll be a matter of, if you were already down that path, you're a winner. And if you're nowhere near down that path, well, you're going to be behind the 8 ball. And you're going to have to either buy some credits from somewhere else. And it's just going to redistribute the short term some funds from a profitability perspective. So that's the short term. Longer term, it'll be, you'll assess, or all the OEMs will look at their product portfolios. They'll look at profitability first. Now, the facts of life, the harsh facts of life. I know we like to talk about, drivetrains and how nice cars look and the various interconnectivity of all the sat navs or whatever the car plays, or all these little dash tricks that we've got. But let's be frank, it's about money. And if you're an OEM, you need to make money, and you look at your portfolio, what is the most profitable ones, and if these new rules impact that, what do you need to do to maintain your level of profitability and adjust your portfolio accordingly? But that won't change any time within the next 1 or 2 months. These are product plans that have been in play for years, and you can tweak your short-term ordering, but the long-term portfolio management is the long-term portfolio management. All OEMs are going greener. All OEMs have some sort of electrification strategy, but also you need some sort of offering that you can supply that is profitable. And often it's the not so green vehicles that are very good profit makers for organisations. So you still want to have them, in your back pocket in the short term so you can make some money.
Looking at medium term, Mark, where do you see the big changes there? Do you think the electric vehicles will ramp up very quickly? Or do you think that's still going to be a slow progress? Because, you and I have spoken about it many times. And as you said, there's only 100,000 electric vehicles on the road at the moment. We still have to put a lot of infrastructure, charging infrastructure, and get all those things right. What's that sort of impact?
There's no doubt, John, that it will increase the uptake of EVs. The uptake is coming. It's not going to stall at the current rate. It's going to continue because you're going to get more and more product. Now, we've had a bit of a spike, which it's great to see that there has been an increase. You look at the Tesla number. So from a brand perspective, Tesla reported 40,000 cars. So 46,000 up from 19 the year before. We know their reporting hasn't been super accurate. 46,000, that's a really respectable number. So you're getting more and more, and this year maybe 60,000, but it's not 1.2 million, and that's the key element that we need to highlight. Even if they make 100,000, it's not 1.2 million. There's still got a long way to go before you get EVs. And I know other brands are bringing EVs. You look at BYD, 12,000 units last year. That's a respectable number. They're a great value for money vehicle from an EV perspective, and that will just continue to grow. But you're right, adoption does take time. We've seen it in Europe. We've seen it particularly in Central Europe, in the Germanys, and even further down south, the adoption still is a long way away from being anything super significant. When you look at the product life cycle, you get innovators, early adopters, and then there's the gap for the early majority. Well, the early majority they're still trying to get a big chunk of that. Yes, in Scandinavia, the early majority is well and truly there, and the late majority's got it as well. Fantastic, and a credit to how they've gone about it. But when you go further south, there's still work to be done. There's still a place for internal combustion. There's still a place for efficient internal combustion. And even we see Europe's resetting their ambitions as far as when they can get rid of internal combustion and just go purely EV and similar technologies that replace the traditional ICE engines.
When we look at the emissions efficiency standards that have just been brought in by government, they're not looking at the mining of the rare earth metals and those type of things. Do you think that's right to do? Or do you think you should just look at tailpipe emissions?
It's the long-standing challenge, and it's been around a very long time, John. I recall back to even when I was back at GM, when I was dealing with governments and supplying vehicles, and the Green Vehicle Guide was used as a figure, and if you scored anything worse than 5.5 in the Green Vehicle Guide, you were off the list. So you needed to have that score, and that just purely looked at CO2 emissions. It didn't look at, say, particulates. So if you'd go down the road of a diesel that had all these particulates and other side issues from a pollutant perspective, but that was okay because you had a green score as far as CO2 emissions. It's a measure. Is it perfect? No. Is it something that we can affect? Because we don't actually manufacture anything here now. So the mining of the rare earth metals does not impact any of the politicians in this country or any of the environmental activists, because none of it, they're not really seeing it here. We do mine lithium and some other bits and pieces, but no one sees it. It's in no one's backyard. What we see are the fires, we see the floods, and then we say we need to have EVs as a result of that. So what happens on the other side of the world when they make these vehicles? It's sight unseen. It's a matter of what is happening when I'm driving it. Am I affecting that change? And that's where the policy is steering us to, is how green is my car.
And Mark, the end of life of vehicles, there's a lot of talk about the developing of the recycling in it. Where do you see that progressing, and where do you think the big opportunities are in that sort of space?
End of life of vehicles, I think there's been significant focus on that in Europe and also in the US. That both of those very, very mature markets are very conscious of what happens from an end of life perspective. I think there is still very much a lack of awareness of that issue in this country for the mainstream motorist. We just look at what we're driving. Is it green? Does it do the job? Does it fit my needs as far as critical purpose? But as far as looking at the end of life, sadly, it's something that's not really considered by most. And I dare say most government agencies would not even be considering it, because when you look at the policies are very much around what's my mission here and now, and they're only looking at the new stuff. It would take a brave government to target low-income earners who have old cars and punish them for doing so. That is the challenge that you've got. You need to give some sort of incentive to end-of-life those vehicles and then have a proper end-of-life recycling process. A bit like, there's been questions around the tyre recycling and what happens with these tyres. So, there's a lot to be done in that area, but we still, I suppose, because it's sight unseen, car disappears, don't know whatever happened to it, we move on to the next new shiny thing that's in the driveway.
Because you're starting to see some manufacturers starting to plan end of life of their new vehicles. So they're planning all the components that they can be recycled at the end of life of the vehicle. And I know I think Renault set up a facility in France that they intend to be able to say in 15 or 20 years, any vehicle manufactured now, they can take back to that plant and recycle the whole vehicle. That's the intention. I think they're doing a lot of work. I think there's other manufacturers doing the same type of thing. What's your perspective and views of that?
The Europeans are well and truly, and Renault's been doing it for many years. In fact, back in the days when you are at Renault, John, that was part of our tender process. And a point of difference with that particular brand was you could tender for a government business as a supplier, and that was part of the pitch. Yes, you had a certain tailpipe emission, but this was something you did as a value add to say, hey, by the way, the bumpers are recyclable to X percent. And these are manufactured from recycled items. Even the water on the roof of the various assembly plants is captured, used, then recycled and reused again in the plant for various functions in those businesses. And that's something that and Renault's been very much towards the forefront of that, because they've been down the EV path for 15, 20 years now. So there's a very much eco skew to how they go about their business. And a lot of manufacturers are, but sadly, once again, it gets back to, if your country's not a manufacturer, what weighting do you put into the validity of that? Because, in a two-horse race, you always back self-interest. So if I don't build cars in my country, do I care that someone's recycling water in a land far, far away to look after their particular patch when I'm worried about bushfires in my backyard? It's interesting, John, when you look at it from a passenger perspective, electric vehicles account for 87,000 sales, and yet hybrids account for 98,000. So we're still down this road of EV is good. 87 is pretty good. That's 8%. That's a reasonable number. We're not 50%. It's 8%. But hybrids are 98. So there's still that range anxiety. And it's funny when you speak to a number of people about the EV journey and this hybrid. Hybrid makes a lot of sense in this country because charging infrastructure is questionable. So you're not going to get stuck on the side of the road if you forget to charge your car. And you need to go to various meetings and you want to just keep pushing through the low charge warning systems that your car's got. But it's funny how many of the hybrids run basically as heavy petrol vehicles, because people are driving them. They forget to plug in and charge them. They drive them. They do some regenerative charging and regenerative braking. So there's a little bit of charge happening, but primarily they're a heavy petrol car. So, and that was always the challenge with many hybrids, that if they're not used around town, if you're saying highway use, you're really just a heavy petrol car. And hydrogen, there were 6 hydrogen vehicles, but petrol is still primarily 588,000 petrols and 379,000 diesels. Diesel still makes sense in an SUV. It's an efficient fuel from a thermal perspective, not ideal from a particular perspective. But it's the irony of the hybrid versus the EV. That's a reasonable number. If you add the two together, you're talking 20% of cars have some sort of electric drive to them. That's not bad. But we know the brands that have been working with the hybrids for some time now. They make sense in the short to medium term on the path to full electrification. And as long as those vehicles, are charged and plugged in and charged, that's the key.
So, Mark, putting a line in the sand, what do you believe the market will be this next year? And what percentage of that will be EVs and hybrids? Where do you see the market going?
Oh, it's interesting because hybrids are up 20%, EVs are up 161%. So there's no doubt the EVs will continue to jump. You're getting more and more cost-effective EVs. Now, don't forget, this is, it's funny, we hear all this chatter about negative gearing and the evil landlords that have negative geared properties that people who can't afford to buy rent. Now, one place that no one talks about, and it's another tax break that many a public servant gets, is the novated lease. Now, there are many a journalist and genius who says, wow, the ACT was ranked very high in EV adoption. That's because you've got a lot of public servants that are on good, solid, steady incomes. Now, how a novated lease works is you use pre-tax dollars to pay for your car. And with an EV, you don't pay fringe benefits tax like you do with, say, an internal combustion car. So basically, taxpayers are paying for those public servants to drive the EVs around Canberra. So I think it's quite funny. You hear the evil landlord conversation, but no one talks about the public servant who's getting the tax break on driving an EV around Canberra because they're on a nice salary. But that's just something to be mindful of. So when you've got these tax benefits for that sector, the next players for novated leases that benefit are in the corporate sector, where you get a novated lease. So those individuals, you don't pay FBT on an EV, so it's a huge win there too. So those guys will continue to jump on because it makes sense to do so, especially with your finance rate going up. You offset that by not paying FBT, so your lease rate's still competitive on an EV. So that means that those EVs are going to continue to grow at a faster rate in that sector. Mum and dad retail, cashed up, will buy it. Novated, definitely, there's incentives to do so. But average Joe retail still will be thinking, do I really need to jump on this EV thing? There's nothing in it for me at this stage. So I think a number, if you think of a number right now, 87 was an EV number in 2023. I'd be looking at least a 130 to 140,000 EVs this year would be a respectable score. If it's anything short of that, it means that we've well and truly hit a wall and the adoption has slowed, but it should be at that level. And I think hybrids will continue. I think it'll push over 100,000. You've got 110. You'd expect that from a hybrid perspective, and then the EVs continue to grow. The big question is it going to be a 1.2 million car market? I don't think so. I think realistically, we speak of this many times, the realistic Australian market is about a 1,550,000, maybe a 1.1 at best. So 1.1 would make sense from a sustainable perspective. What you will start to see is more demo clearances, a lot more retail activity from retail advertising. There'll be price pressure. Used cars are already pushed down from a price perspective because you're getting pre-reporting and you're getting good supply of new. So it makes sense to go down this path. So, John, let me ask you some questions. Where do you see the market going in 2024?
I think you make a very good point. I think it's definitely going to pull back, but by how much? I think there's quite a few headwinds from an economic point of view. So I don't think it's going to be at the 1.1. I think it's going to be closer to the 1 million mark. I could be wrong in that. And it all depends on the pre-reporting in it. So they might get some of that stock moved through. But the realistic size of the market maybe at 1 million, 1,050,000 at most. That's my personal perspective. But it's very difficult to tell. But I think it's definitely not going to be sitting at where it's been sitting this last year. I think that there was a lot of pent-up supply, and that was just fulfilling some of that supply. And in addition to that, the population grew substantially through immigration, and that kept the market buoyant, and that sort of meted out into the market this last year. But I think that will all come back now. I think the government's putting a lot more restrictions about the number of students coming in, while they're actually studying, what they're doing. I think they're going to curb back immigration, because there's been huge issues around housing affordability, and it's sort of backfired on government. So I think there's a lot of challenges around that space. So I think with all that cutting back, I think we'll push the market back down again.
The world has changed in the auto industry for what it was in the late teens to where it is in the 2024. So we're now already in the mid-20s now. 1.1 might become the standard as far as where the market is at. As long as real estate stays buoyant, that will be a realistic thing. If real estate starts coming back a bit and you've got an oversupply, well, maybe the $50,000 median price point for a new car starts dropping back as discounting kicks in again. The upside is EVs are more expensive, so we're paying more for those cars. But then again, the downside is you take the FBT off and the transaction price comes back in. And then you have more affordable EVs coming in. Thanks for listening. Hopefully you got as much out of our predictions as we enjoyed giving them.